The fire is crackling, the night is quiet, and the world outside has slipped into shadow. Tonight, we turn our gaze back to the 19th century, to a time of corsets and crinolines, of lace gloves and candlelight. On the surface, the Victorian woman appeared immaculate, her gown pressed, her face powdered, her manners refined. Yet behind closed doors, reality was far less elegant. For beneath the satin and lace, there lingered odors, unwashed linens, and curious rituals of hygiene that to our modern eyes seem, well, quite disgusting. You found your way to Dame of Legends, a place for stories of history, myth, and the forgotten. Settle in by the fire, and allow me to guide you through the secret world of Victorian hygiene, the things polite society never spoke of, but everyone endured. In Victorian England, bathing was not the daily ritual we take for granted today. For many women, stepping into a tub of water was a rare and sometimes frightening event. Why? Because at the time, water itself was viewed with suspicion. Doctors and pamphlets warned that too much bathing might weaken the body, open the pores to illness, or even damage a woman's delicate constitution. The fear was rooted in a popular belief called the miasma theory, the idea that foul odors carried disease. A dip in warm water, it was thought, left you vulnerable to those invisible vapors. As a result, full baths were often reserved for the ill, the wealthy, or the particularly daring. For ordinary women, a basin and cloth might suffice for days, or even weeks at a time. Imagine the scene. A pitcher of lukewarm water carried up narrow stairs, poured carefully into a porcelain bowl. A woman would splash her face, dab at her hands, perhaps sponge her neck, but hair, arms, and legs might go untouched. A full body washing could be postponed indefinitely, especially in the chill of winter when homes were hard to heat and bath water cooled almost instantly. For the poor, the situation was even bleaker. Access to clean water was limited, and soap, made from animal fat and lye, was costly. In cramped lodgings, privacy was rare, and a bath meant hauling heavy buckets from a pump or a shared spigot in the yard. In cities like London, water companies delivered only a few hours of service each day. Once the taps ran dry, there was nothing to fill a tub with. And yet, the ideal of cleanliness was constantly preached. Advertisements promised miraculous soaps and powders, while etiquette manuals advised women to keep themselves pure and fresh. But behind these words, reality was less polished. Many Victorian women changed their chemise more often than they bathed. A clean undergarment, worn close to the skin, was thought to absorb impurities, and therefore serve in place of washing. Among the wealthy, bathing might take on a more theatrical air. Some mansions contained elaborate bathing rooms, tiled in marble, decorated with mirrors and ornate taps. Yet, even here, water was often reused. Servants filled the tub for the mistress of the house, then carried the same murky bathwater for her daughters, and finally for the lower staff. By the end, the water was hardly fit for a sponge, but every drop was too precious to waste. And what of soap? Not the foamy, floral-scented bars we know today. Victorian soaps were harsh, caustic, and sometimes laced with chemicals that burned the skin. Women often avoided scrubbing too vigorously, fearing the soap would roughen their complexion or spoil the softness of their hands. Instead, perfumes and powders disguised whatever odors lingered beneath. Even the idea of cold water was controversial. A bracing splash was said to harden the constitution, but doctors warned that sudden immersion might shock a fragile heart or ruin fertility. Mothers often scolded their daughters for washing their hair too often, believing it drained vital energy. A once-monthly shampoo, sometimes with egg yolk or vinegar, was considered sufficient. Of course, there were exceptions. The Turkish bath movement swept across Britain in the mid-19th century, introducing steam rooms and hot plunges to curious Victorians. For a few shillings, women could recline in heated chambers, sweat out their impurities, and be vigorously scrubbed by attendants. But such indulgences remained luxuries for the fashionable, not the everyday reality of most women. So, when we picture the well-dressed Victorian lady stepping delicately into her carriage, we must remember what lingered beneath the silk and lace. A body only occasionally touched by water, skin powdered but rarely scrubbed, and a society caught between fear of disease and fear of the bath itself. Let us turn now to the mouth and the curious rituals of Victorian oral hygiene. To us, brushing our teeth twice a day is second nature. But to a woman in 19th century Britain, it was anything but. Toothcare was a blend of old traditions, strange powders, and dangerous advice, none of which guaranteed a bright smile. Brushing itself was far from universal. Many women relied instead on rinses or pastes sold in small tins. Some simply wiped their teeth with a cloth dipped in water or vinegar. A toothbrush, if they owned one at all, was a stiff little instrument, its handle carved from bone, its bristles made from horsehair or even pig. Those coarse bristles scraped at enamel, frayed quickly, and often did more harm than good. Then came the powders. Advertisements promised pearly teeth and a breath like violets. In reality, these mixtures were often chalk, charcoal, or brick dust, ground to a fine grit. Some contained salt, others even traces of pumice. These abrasive powders polished the surface, yes, but at the cost of thinning the enamel. Each scrub left teeth weaker, more sensitive, and prone to decay. Stranger still were the rinses. A dash of vinegar might whiten. Spirits like gin or brandy were sometimes swished through the mouth to cleanse the gums. And in the darker corners of advice columns, women were told to rinse with urine, believed since ancient times to whiten teeth. And then there was ammonia. Bottled as spirit of hartshorn, it was recommended in tiny doses to freshen breath. Imagine the sting upon the tongue, the sharp fumes filling the nose, all in the hope of smelling sweet in company. Yet despite all these rituals, toothache was a common companion. Dentistry was crude, and extractions were often the only solution. Women wore false teeth made of ivory, porcelain, or, gruesomely enough, human teeth purchased from the poor. A lady's smile, admired at a ball, might in fact belong partly to someone else. Even when clean teeth were achieved, the gums often told another story. Red, swollen, receding, symptoms of scurvy or infection. Without modern understanding of bacteria, women relied on powders and perfumes to mask, rather than cure, these troubles. So the image of a delicate Victorian lady speaking softly behind her fan may conceal more than modesty. It may have been an effort to hide a mouth worn down by chalk and vinegar, or a smile cobbled together from ivory and bone. Hair has always been a symbol of beauty, but in the Victorian age it carried a weight far greater than we might imagine. A woman's hair was often called her crowning glory, a mark of virtue, femininity, and health. Yet caring for that hair was no simple matter, and the habits that developed around it were often as unpleasant as they were elaborate. Washing hair with water was rare. Many women believed that wetting the scalp too often would lead to chills, illness, or even madness. Doctors warned that frequent washing could weaken a woman's nerves or dull her mind. Instead, hair was freshened with powders, starch, rice flour, or even pulverized orris root, which left a sweet, violet-like fragrance. This powder absorbed oil, but it also built up over time, leaving the scalp itchy and heavy. To give shine and manageability, women relied on pomades. These were thick, greasy substances made from animal fats, suet, or bear grease, mixed with perfumes. Some recipes added wax, making the hair stiff and sticky. Imagine layers of perfumed fat coating every strand, warmed by the heat of a crowded ballroom. The scent might be sweet, but the reality was cloying, and once the pomade grew rancid, it produced a smell difficult to disguise. Lice were a constant problem. Infestation was not confined to the poor. Anyone with long, seldom washed hair was at risk. Remedies included combing with fine metal teeth, dusting the scalp with mercury-based powders, or rubbing kerosene into the roots. Each of these methods brought its own dangers: scalp burns, chemical poisoning, or hair that simply broke away in clumps. Hairstyles themselves added to the trouble. Elaborate braids, coiled buns, and towering arrangements were pinned tightly into place and left for days at a time. Removing such constructions was tedious, and many women preferred to sleep with them intact. Imagine lying down with a head full of pins, hair stiff with pomade, knowing that undoing it all would take an hour or more. Some women even hired maids to do the work, and the hair might not be fully loosened for a week. Some women, particularly in urban centers, turned to hairdressers for elaborate weekly arrangements. These professionals applied layers of pomade, powders, and pins to construct towering styles that could withstand dances, carriage rides, and social calls. The more elaborate the style, the less likely it was to be dismantled at home. For days afterward, women walked carefully, slept stiffly, and relied on perfumes to keep the hair fresh until the next appointment. When fashion demanded even greater volume, wigs and hairpieces were employed. These were not modern, breathable wigs, but heavy, dense creations often woven from human hair purchased in markets. Across Europe, hair merchants traveled from village to village, buying locks from peasant girls who needed money. That hair was then crafted into the flowing braids and curls worn by the wealthy. It was a strange, silent trade, one woman's poverty transforming into another's glamour. The hygiene of these wigs was questionable. They absorbed sweat, perfumes, and smoke from the air. Cleaning them required powders and brushing, but seldom water. Over time, the wigs developed their own odor, mingling with the pomade beneath. To mask this, women leaned on the ever-present crutch of the Victorian age: perfume. Colognes, lavender water, and rose oils were dabbed not only on the skin, but into the hair itself, layering scent upon scent. And then there was the ever-present soot of Victorian life. In London or Manchester, coal smoke clung to every surface, including hair. Imagine long tresses gathering the fine black dust of chimneys and lamps, holding it fast in layers of pomade. Even when brushed, the residue lingered, leaving hair dull and heavy. It was an invisible burden of city life, one that women endured quietly, while society admired the elegance of their coiffures. There were also curious household recipes for hair care. Manuals advised rubbing the scalp with rum to encourage growth, or with onions and garlic to stimulate circulation. Others swore by goose fat, or by rinsing the hair in beer to add shine. Some even recommended the ashes of burned bread, mixed with vinegar, as a kind of early shampoo. These concoctions sometimes worked, but more often left the hair sticky, smelly, or brittle. Hair loss was common. Between poor diet, illness, and the strain of heavy hairstyles, many women found their hair thinning. Wigs and hairpieces concealed the loss, but there was also a thriving market for restoratives. Bottles promised miraculous regrowth through secret ingredients, though most contained nothing more than alcohol, oils, or colored water. And let us not forget the Victorian love of hair as keepsake. Locks were cut from loved ones and braided into jewelry, woven into brooches, or framed as mourning tokens. These relics were often unwashed, preserved just as they were snipped from the head. In a world already struggling with lice and odor, it is unsettling to imagine how many of these sentimental treasures carried something far less romantic. So when we picture the flowing locks of a Victorian lady, shining in candlelight, we must look a little closer. Beneath the powder and pomade, there may have been weeks of sweat, nests of lice, and the faint trace of goose fat or kerosene. Beauty in this age was seldom clean. Clothing in the Victorian era was not only a matter of fashion, but of morality and class. A lady was expected to appear immaculate, her dress a symbol of discipline and virtue. But beneath the silks and satins lay a hidden world of sweat, dust, and odors. The layers that gave Victorian women their distinctive silhouette also trapped dirt, and laundering them was a task so laborious that garments were often worn far longer than we might imagine. At the base of it all lay the chemise, a simple linen or cotton undergarment worn closest to the skin. In theory, its purpose was practical. It absorbed sweat and oils, sparing the outer dress from too much soil, but many women owned only a few chemises, and laundry was done infrequently. A chemise might be worn for several days, sometimes for a week or more, before being changed. By then it was heavy with perspiration, the fabric stiffened by the body's natural oils. Above the chemise came the corset, the defining garment of the age. Stiffened with whalebone or steel, the corset shaped the figure into the desired hourglass form. But corsets were seldom washed. They absorbed the odors of sweat and skin, yet cleaning them risked warping the delicate boning or rusting the metal eyelets. Instead, women relied on chemises and powders to protect the corset. Over time, however, the fabric yellowed, the stays grew brittle, and the odor of long use lingered in the garment's seams. Then came the petticoats, sometimes several, worn together to achieve fullness. Made of heavy cotton or flannel, petticoats absorbed heat and sweat. Imagine walking down a crowded London street, layered in chemise, corset, petticoats, skirt, and overskirt, all beneath the smog-filled air. The weight was suffocating, and laundering so many layers was nearly impossible for working women. Petticoats might be hung to air by a window, but washing them regularly was a luxury. The outer gowns themselves were often made of wool, silk, or velvet, fabrics difficult to clean. Dry cleaning, as we know it today, did not yet exist. Instead, dresses were brushed, sponged, or aired out. Perfume once again became the solution to smells that could not be washed away. A woman might attend ball after ball in the same gown, its fabric absorbing the smoke of candles and the musk of crowded halls, while her chemise beneath struggled to contain the odor of her body. Stockings and drawers added to the problem. Stockings, usually of wool or cotton, grew damp with sweat and clung to the legs. Washing them was easier than washing dresses, but many households lacked sufficient water or soap to keep up with the need. Drawers, early underpants, were sometimes open at the crotch for convenience, which meant they offered little protection from odors or stains. Hygiene in such garments was more hope than reality. Laundry itself was a back-breaking chore. Before the advent of washing machines, clothes were boiled in large tubs, scrubbed on washboards, and wrung out by hand. Soap was harsh, made with lye, and could eat away at delicate fabrics. Women without servants often postponed laundry day as long as possible. For the poor, laundering heavy garments might be done only once or twice a month. In the meantime, garments were aired, brushed, and sprinkled with vinegar or lemon to disguise their condition. There were also class differences in clothing hygiene. A wealthy woman might send her linens to a professional laundress, ensuring fresher chemises and stockings. Yet, even the wealthy rarely washed their gowns or corsets. Meanwhile, working-class women had far fewer garments and wore them to exhaustion. A maid might wear the same dress for months, patching holes and dabbing stains until the fabric was threadbare. And then there was the simple problem of waste. Menstrual care, in particular, was rudimentary. Disposable products did not exist, and cloth rags, euphemistically called monthly cloths, were washed and reused. For many women, this meant stains that never fully lifted, odors that lingered, and the constant anxiety of being discovered. Etiquette demanded absolute silence on such matters, but the reality was one every woman endured. In public, a Victorian lady appeared the picture of restraint and cleanliness. Her gown was pressed, her gloves spotless, her parasol raised against the sun. But beneath, her chemise clung to her body, her corset reeked faintly of sweat, and her petticoats grew heavy with dust from the street. The more layers she wore, the more private odors and discomforts she carried. The paradox of Victorian clothing was that the very garments meant to elevate women, to mark them as refined, pure, and civilized, often left them dirtier than they might otherwise have been. For while a single clean chemise might have sufficed, fashion demanded layer upon layer, each one trapping heat and filth. A woman was judged by her dress, but rarely by what lay beneath it. So when we picture the elegant silhouette of a Victorian lady gliding through a drawing room with poise, we must also picture the hidden truth. Corsets never washed, chemises stiff with sweat, stockings damp at the knees, and petticoats heavy with grime. Elegance in this age was often only surface deep. When we think of the Victorian woman, it is often her face that comes first to mind. Pale, composed, framed by hair carefully arranged. A face that seemed untouched by time, unmarked by sweat or labor. Yet the reality of Victorian beauty was one of powders, creams, and tonics, many of them dangerous, some outright poisonous. Skincare was less about cleanliness than about illusion. The prevailing ideal was a complexion as white as porcelain. Pale skin signified wealth and leisure, proof that a woman did not toil outdoors under the sun. To achieve this, women reached for powders that masked freckles, softened redness, and left the skin ghostly white. But these powders were not the safe, talc-based cosmetics of later generations. Instead, they were concoctions of lead carbonate, zinc oxide, and even chalk. Applied daily, they clogged pores, irritated the skin, and slowly poisoned the body. Lead-based cosmetics were especially insidious. At first, they gave a desirable smoothness to the skin, covering imperfections and creating that doll-like appearance admired in society portraits. But over time, lead seeped into the bloodstream, causing headaches, muscle weakness, and tremors. The very powder that gave the illusion of health was quietly destroying it. There are stories of women whose once glowing faces grew gray, their hair falling, their bodies weakening, all while they continued to dust their cheeks in pursuit of beauty. Creams and lotions promised softness, but their ingredients were often worse. Arsenic wafers were sold with the claim that they would purify the skin from within. Women swallowed them like medicine, hoping for a flawless glow. The side effects were devastating: nausea, hair loss, and in the most tragic cases, death. And yet, advertisements insisted that arsenic was nature's gift to beauty, urging women to ignore the whispers of danger. There were also complexion waters, sold in elegant glass bottles and advertised in fashion magazines. These waters were often mixtures of ammonia, mercury, and alcohol, with rose or lavender oils to mask the sting. Applied with a cloth, they stripped oils from the skin, leaving it dry and cracked. Women sometimes carried small bottles in their reticules, dabbing their faces between social calls, each application tightening the mask that society demanded. Perfume played its own role in the illusion. It was not merely a finishing touch, but a necessity in a world where soap and water were used sparingly. Women dabbed colognes behind their ears, at the wrists, in the folds of their gowns, and even directly onto the skin of their faces. A faint cloud of lavender or rose might give the impression of freshness where none existed. But heavy use of perfume could become overpowering, a mingling of floral sweetness with the less pleasant odors it tried to conceal. And then there were the eyes. To create a wide, luminous gaze, some women turned to belladonna drops, made from the deadly nightshade plant. Just a drop in each eye dilated the pupils, giving the desired softness. But the effect came at a cost: blurred vision, dizziness, and long-term damage to sight. Still, the fashion persisted, and the glitter of candlelight in artificially widened eyes was considered worth the risk. The mouth, too, received attention. Lip colors existed, but to wear them openly was to risk scandal. respectable women were expected to appear naturally beautiful, not painted like actresses or prostitutes. So instead of bold pigments, women used subtle tints, stains of carmine from crushed cochineal insects or a dab of beet juice, to redden the lips without leaving obvious trace. Some bit their lips or cheeks lightly before entering a room, raising a flush of color that would fade quickly, but leave the impression of health. Home recipes for skincare abounded. Some women washed their faces in milk, believing it softened and whitened. Others rubbed on honey or egg whites to tighten the skin. Vinegar mixed with rose petals was recommended as a toner. These remedies were safer, though not always effective, and they carried the added challenge of spoilage. A basin of sour milk left on a dressing table was hardly the sweet vision painted in etiquette manuals. The great irony of Victorian makeup was that it was meant to be invisible. A woman was supposed to look as if she had no need of powders or creams, as if her beauty were entirely natural. To be caught painting was to risk gossip and ridicule. And yet, behind closed doors, even the most respectable households had their little jars and boxes tucked into dressing tables, ready to be applied before the next ball or garden party. Some beauty practices were less about vanity than about sheer survival in a smelly world. Coal smoke, candle soot, and gas lamps left the skin grimy. Without daily baths, pores clogged quickly. Women wiped their faces with handkerchiefs, sponged with vinegar water, or dabbed with powders to feel clean, even when the body beneath told another story. And we cannot forget the masks worn at night. Cold creams of lanolin and whale oil were smeared thickly onto the skin, left to soak in while a woman slept. These creams softened and smoothed, but they also left pillows stained with grease, and rooms heavy with the odor of tallow. Husbands and servants alike complained of the smell, but fashion and vanity excused it. The obsession with whiteness was also tied to class. Working-class women, exposed to the sun in fields or factories, could never hope to maintain the same pale ideal. Their skin bore freckles, tans, and calluses, which society marked as coarse. Middle and upper-class women, shielded by parasols and powders, reinforced the illusion that paleness was natural, when in fact it was manufactured at great cost. So, the face of the Victorian lady, admired in portraits and remembered in novels, was not the soft bloom of health we might imagine. It was a mask built of chalk and lead, brightened with arsenic, perfumed with rosewater, and sharpened by belladonna. Beneath the smooth exterior lay irritated pores, poisoned blood, and eyes that strained to see through the haze of beauty's demands. And yet society applauded. To look delicate, to appear untouched by labor or illness, was to be seen as a true lady. No one spoke of the sores that developed under powders, or the faint smell of vinegar and grease that lingered beneath the perfume. These truths remained hidden, just as the chamber pots and unwashed chemises were hidden beneath silks and lace. So when we picture the perfect Victorian face, pale, serene, softly glowing in candlelight, we must remember the reality. It was not health that shone there, but artifice. Behind the veil of powder and perfume stood women who sacrificed their bodies to the demands of fashion, who traded comfort and safety for a fleeting illusion of beauty. If the body of the Victorian woman bore the marks of poor hygiene, her home carried the same burden. Behind the polished facades of townhouses and the picturesque charm of cottages lay a daily battle against dirt, odors, and waste. To understand hygiene in the Victorian age, we must step not just into the dressing room, but into the parlor, the kitchen, and above all, the privy. The greatest challenge was sanitation. Indoor plumbing was rare outside the homes of the very wealthy. For most households, chamber pots were the norm, ceramic or metal vessels tucked discreetly under beds or in washstands. In the middle of the night, a woman might rise quietly, relieve herself into the pot, and return it to its hiding place. In the morning, servants, or in poorer homes, the women themselves, emptied the contents into the yard, the gutter, or a cesspit at the rear of the house. Imagine the smell of a summer morning in London. Chamber pots sloshed into open drains, mingling with horse manure, kitchen waste, and coal smoke. Even in respectable homes, odors were constant companions. Privies, small wooden outhouses, often stood in the garden. Without modern plumbing, waste collected in pits beneath, emptied only when they overflowed or became unbearable. Night soil men, as they were called, hauled the filth away in carts, spreading the stench as they passed. For women, the act of using such privies was unpleasant, and yet unavoidable. Privacy was scarce, cleanliness rarer still. Laundry, too, carried its own indignities. Without machines, washing was an ordeal. Clothes were boiled in large copper tubs, scrubbed by hand on rough boards, and wrung out until the skin of the washerwoman's hands cracked. Soap was coarse and caustic, stinging cuts and leaving fabrics rough. Water had to be carried upstairs, heated over fires, and poured carefully into tubs. Imagine the steam rising, heavy with the sour smell of sweat-soaked linens, the sharp sting of lye soap, the ache of muscles after hours of labor. Because of this, laundry was postponed as long as possible. Linens and undergarments were stretched for days or weeks, gowns for months. Instead of washing, women aired garments by open windows, brushed away dust, or sponged at visible stains. Vinegar or lemon might be sprinkled into water to disguise odors. Perfumed sachets were tucked into drawers, lavender sprigs pressed between sheets. But none of this erased the truth. Clothing was seldom truly clean. The air inside Victorian homes was another challenge. Coal was the chief fuel, and fires burned constantly to heat rooms and cook meals. Soot collected on walls, curtains, and lungs alike. Women wiped their furniture daily, only to find a fresh layer of black dust the next morning. Gas lamps hissed and smoked, filling rooms with an acrid haze. Candles dripped tallow, leaving both stains and smell. For women tasked with keeping homes presentable, the battle against dirt was one they could never win. Water supply added further difficulty. In cities, water was rationed by private companies, available for only a few hours each day. Pipes ran filthy with sediment, and outbreaks of cholera and typhoid traced back to contaminated wells. Boiling water was essential, yet fuel itself was expensive. Poor families often risked drinking what was available, their health sacrificed to necessity. For the wealthier, servants carried bucket after bucket upstairs to fill basins and tubs. Even then, water grew cold quickly, and hauling it was exhausting. Kitchen hygiene was no better. Ice boxes, the ancestors of refrigerators, kept food cool with blocks of ice, but spoilage was constant. Milk soured quickly, meat grew rank in the summer heat, and bread turned moldy. Women sprinkled salt to preserve meat, smoked hams in chimneys, or stored vegetables in cellars. Yet odors crept through kitchens, mingling with coal smoke and wastewater. Flies hovered, rats scurried, and servants fought a losing battle against decay. The smells of a Victorian home were layered and inescapable. There was the musk of unwashed bodies beneath layers of perfume, the acrid sting of coal fires, the sourness of damp laundry, the ammonia of chamber pots, the rot of food past its prime. Candles and incense masked some, open windows carried others into the street, but the overall effect was one of constant, lingering odor. To live in such a space was to accept filth as part of life. Even bedchambers, those supposed havens of rest, were not free from it. Mattresses were stuffed with horsehair, straw, or feathers, rarely replaced and seldom cleaned. They absorbed sweat, smoke, and pests. sheets were washed infrequently, and blankets carried the dust of the room. Curtains and carpets, thick and heavy, trapped soot and smells. For the women who maintained these rooms, cleanliness was a goal always chased, but never fully achieved. Class again played a role in this hidden hygiene. Wealthy women employed armies of maids to scrub, haul water, and wash linens. Even so, their grand homes suffered from the same coal soot and chamber pot smells as the humblest dwellings. For the poor, conditions were harsher. Tenement housing crammed families into small rooms, sharing privies that overflowed, water pumps that fouled, and laundry lines strung across filthy yards. Women in these homes worked endlessly, yet their labor could not conquer the filth of poverty. It is easy to imagine the Victorian parlor from novels: polished tables, gleaming silver, ladies seated in gowns of silk. But hidden just beyond the door, in kitchens and yards, were the smells and stains of daily life. A polished exterior concealed chamber pots, sour laundry, and smoke-thick air. Respectability was a mask, as fragile and artificial as the powders painted on the skin. So when we picture a Victorian woman in her home, we must look beyond the lace curtains and embroidered cushions. She lived in a world of coal smoke and chamber pots, of damp linens and spoiled milk, of endless scrubbing that never erased the dirt. The home was not a sanctuary from filth, but a mirror of it, its smells and stains clinging as stubbornly as perfume upon the body. The greatest irony of Victorian hygiene was not the chamber pot under the bed, the corset steeped in sweat, or the powder laced with lead. It was the contradiction between appearance and reality, the mask society demanded, and the truth that lingered beneath. To be a Victorian woman was to live under constant scrutiny, her reputation judged not only by her manners, but by the illusion of cleanliness. Etiquette manuals of the time were relentless in their demands. A lady was to rise early, bathe modestly, dress neatly, and carry herself with grace. Her breath was to be sweet, her gloves spotless, her complexion pure. Entire chapters of advice literature were devoted to preserving this fragile image. "A woman must appear ever fresh," one manual declared, "for her presence reflects the purity of her home." Yet the very women who read these words often lived in homes where coal soot blackened the curtains and chamber pots soured the air. Cleanliness became a performance, not a reality. A lady might powder her face with chalk to hide blemishes, perfume her hair to mask grease, and brush her gown free of soot. She could sit in a drawing room, her hands folded gracefully, while beneath the layers her chemise clung with sweat. Visitors saw the polished exterior. Only her maid, or her own discomfort, knew the truth. The poor bore the harshest judgment. Factory girls and servants, working long hours in hot, filthy conditions, were often accused of coarseness because they could not maintain the pale skin and spotless clothes of their wealthier sisters. Yet, it was not laziness, but poverty that barred them from soaps, perfumes, or spare linens. They might sleep two to a bed, sharing blankets that reeked of smoke and damp, rising each morning to put on the same patched dress. Respectable society turned up its nose, all the while ignoring the lice that nestled in its own perfumed wigs. Even among the wealthy, contradictions abounded. Queen Victoria herself was praised for her moral purity, yet in her household, chamber pots were emptied daily, and laundry was carried out by exhausted maids who could never hope to meet the ideals they served. The glamour of the court was built on labor and filth, swept from sight, but never truly gone. The more polished the exterior, the greater the hidden toil behind it. Perfume, too, was emblematic of the contradiction. To wear it was to appear refined, a woman of taste. Yet perfume existed precisely because true cleanliness was elusive. The scents of rose, lavender, or bergamot floated through ballrooms, covering sweat, soot, and the lingering smell of grease. Respectability itself smelled of disguise. There was also the paradox of modesty. Women were expected to guard their bodies, never speaking of menstruation, digestion, or the realities of bathing. To discuss such things was vulgar. And yet, these same women endured stained linens, unwashed corsets, and powders that poisoned their skin. Silence was demanded. Reality was endured. Their suffering was private, their appearances public. Literature of the time reflected this divide. In novels, heroines were described as ethereal, their skin flawless, their gowns rustling without a trace of dirt. Rarely did an author mention the odors of crowded streets, the grime of coal, or the fact that those gowns were seldom washed. The public imagination preferred the dream of purity, not the details of hygiene. Reality belonged to servants, to mothers scrubbing linens, to women who carried water up endless flights of stairs. And yet, despite the filth, the Victorian era was obsessed with morality. Soap manufacturers seized on this contradiction, advertising their products as symbols of civilization itself. To wash with Pears's soap was not merely to be clean. It was to be virtuous, modern, and respectable. The irony was sharp. Soap was marketed as moral salvation in a society where most people could not afford to use it daily. Cleanliness was not only a personal struggle, but a moral performance. For women, this performance was doubly binding. A man might arrive at his club, smelling faintly of tobacco and sweat, and still be received as a gentleman. But a woman was judged with harsher eyes. If her breath was sour, if her gloves were stained, if her skin was marked with freckles or blemishes, whispers followed. She was expected to uphold the illusion at any cost, even if the cost was her health. Arsenic wafers, belladonna drops, lead powders, each was consumed in pursuit of an ideal that could never be fully reached. There was a cruelty in these contradictions. Women were told that their virtue, their respectability, and even their marriage prospects depended on a perfection that daily life made impossible. The coal dust clung, the corset pinched, the chamber pot stank. And still she must smile, powdered and perfumed, as though none of it touched her. The performance was endless, exhausting, and often damaging. So when we imagine the Victorian lady, graceful, refined, and pure, we must peel back the layers. Beneath the powdered face was poisoned skin. Beneath the silk gown, a chemise stiff with sweat. Beneath the parlor's polished furniture, chamber pots, coal smoke, and spoiled food. The contradictions were not hidden to the women themselves. They lived them every day. But society preferred the dream, and women bore the burden of making that dream appear real. In the end, the story of Victorian hygiene is not just about dirt or disease. It is about appearances and expectations, about the distance between what was seen and what was endured. It is a reminder that history, like beauty, is often painted in flattering tones, while the truth lingers just beneath the surface. And so, our journey through the hidden world of Victorian hygiene draws to a close. For the past hour, we have walked behind the lace curtains and into the dressing rooms, the kitchens, and the bedrooms of a bygone age. We have seen how the polished image of the Victorian woman was carefully constructed, layer upon layer of gowns, powders, perfumes, and etiquette. But we have also seen how that image masked a reality far less glamorous. Chamber pots beneath the bed, corsets never washed, chemises stiff with sweat, and faces whitened with poisonous powders. The contradiction lies at the heart of the era. A society that prided itself on refinement and progress lived with odors, stains, and dangers that no amount of perfume could hide. The Victorian lady was expected to embody purity and grace, yet her daily life was steeped in discomfort, secrecy, and endless labor to maintain appearances. Cleanliness was not a state of being, but a performance, a fragile illusion that concealed the dirt of reality. It is easy to romanticize the 19th century. We imagine candlelit parlors, sweeping gowns and genteel manners. Novels and portraits encourage us to see only the beauty, but history, when examined closely, is rarely so tidy. It is filled with contradictions, with silences, and with the struggles of ordinary people who lived behind the polished surface. To understand the Victorians, we must remember not only their elegance, but also their filth. Not only their refinement, but also the discomforts they endured in silence. For the women of the age, this silence was particularly heavy. They bore the burden of society's expectations, expected to appear spotless, virtuous, and composed, even when their bodies and homes told a different story. They learned to disguise the smells of unwashed linen with lavender, to mask the sting of sweat with rose water, to sit gracefully in drawing rooms while their corsets pinched and their stockings chafed. They played their parts so well that history often forgets the truth. Tonight, by the fire, we have tried to remember it. If there is a lesson to be drawn from their contradictions, it is this: appearances deceive. The glowing portraits of the past are not lies, but they are only part of the story. Beneath every polished surface is another truth, waiting quietly to be uncovered. In peeling back those layers, we see not just dirt and discomfort, but the resilience of women who endured it, and the society that demanded it of them. And now, as the fire burns low and our story comes to an end, I want to thank you for keeping me company tonight. You found your way to Dame of Legends, a place for history, myth, and the forgotten. If you'd like to carry a small piece of these stories into your daily life, I design history-inspired shirts and cozy pieces at sugarspiceapparel.com. You'll find a link in the description should you wish to explore. It is never a demand, only an invitation, just as tonight's story was an invitation to step back in time. So let us close the curtains on the 19th century, leaving its perfumes and powders, its chamber pots and corsets, in the past where they belong. As you return to your own world, may you carry with you not only the image of Victorian elegance, but also the memory of its hidden realities. History, like life, is always more complex than it first appears. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your fires warm, and your stories full of wonder. Good night.